Of all the archives in the world, there is one from which no document ever truly escapes. Of all the crypts beneath our ancient cities, there is one where the shadows are not merely an absence of light, but a presence of their own. This is not a story you will find in any sanctioned guidebook or any papal audience. This is the story of what lies beneath the very heart of Christendom, secrets so horrifying they were sealed not with stone, but with silence. Welcome to History 1. Subscribe now, for what you're about to hear is only the first layer of the dark truth. Your journey begins here. The Vatican City, a sovereign enclave within Rome, is a place of profound public faith and majestic ceremony. Millions of pilgrims tread its sun-drenched piazzas each year, their eyes lifted to the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, a symbol of celestial aspiration. But beneath their feet, hidden from the crushing weight of sunlight and scrutiny, exists another Vatican entirely, a labyrinthine underworld of crypts, necropolises, forgotten archives, and tunnels that predate Christianity itself. This is the scavi, the excavations. And it is here, in the cold, silent dark, that the first whispers of a horrifying secret begin to stir. Our story does not start with a grand conspiracy, but with a simple, practical need. In 1939, as Europe teetered on the brink of war, Pope Pius XI requested to be buried in the ancient grottos beneath St. Peter's, close to the traditional tomb of the first apostle. To prepare his final resting place, workers began to dig, but their spades struck not earth, but history. As they excavated deeper, they broke through a wall and into a long-forgotten necropolis, a city of the dead from the Roman era. This was no random cemetery. It was a street of marble-faced mausoleums, perfectly preserved, lining a narrow Roman road. The air, unchanged for nearly 2 millennia, was thick with the scent of damp soil and time. Archaeologists were summoned, and what they found was astonishing. Elaborate frescoes of pagan myths adorned the walls: Hercules, Medusa, Dionysian feasts. But alongside these, in a stunning synchronicity of belief, were the earliest Christian symbols ever discovered: the Good Shepherd, Jonah and the whale, prayers etched in Greek. This was the Vatican Hill necropolis, where both Roman and early Christian families, often one and the same, buried their dead. The dig had to proceed in absolute secrecy, for at its heart, beneath the central altar of the entire basilica, was the target, the Trypeion of Gaius, a 2nd-century shrine long believed to mark the grave of St. Peter himself. The world would eventually learn of Peter's purported bones, found in a humble grave amid graffiti declaring, "Peter is here." But what the official reports meticulously omitted were the other things found in that dark, sacred soil. As the archaeologists carefully sifted through the stratigraphy of history, they uncovered artifacts that didn't fit the narrative. Fragments of an old occult object made of a black non-local stone, etched with symbols that were neither Roman nor Christian. Bones that were not human, interred with deliberate ritualistic care. And one sealed chamber off the main street of tombs that was not entered. Its door, a simple slab of travertine, bore a single chilling mark, an inverted sigil, not quite a cross, crudely chiselled and then partially scratched away. The lead archaeologist, a devout man, noted in his private journal, "A presence here defies blessing. The ground is not silent, it watches." The Pope was informed. Work was ordered to continue but to redirect. The chamber was to be bypassed, walled up once more, and omitted from all official plans. It was declared a structural anomaly. But the secret of the Vatican Crypts is this: nothing is ever sealed permanently. It merely waits. The sealed chamber beneath the high altar was forgotten, officially at least in the tumult of the World War II, but its echo reverberated in the highest, most clandestine circles of the Vatican. There exists, within the Curia, an office so obscure its very name is known only to a handful. It is called the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum, but it is far more than the famous secret archives. It is the repository for things that cannot be known, artifacts that defy theology, and documents that speak of a history the Church has vowed to forget. It was here, in a vault behind a vault, that the first true understanding of the horror began to coalesce. The key was not a single discovery, but a pattern, a thread of disturbing consistency pulled from centuries of disparate reports. In the 15th century, During the chaotic excavation for the new St. Peter's Basilica, workers had fled a section of tunnelling, speaking of a breath from the earth that was not air but a sigh. The foreman's report, buried in a ledger of expenses, noted the sudden death of 3 labourers from no discernible cause, their bodies unmarked, yet faces fixed in a rictus of alarm. The site was filled with rubble and concreted over. 2 centuries later, during the adornment of the Grotta Vatican, the papal crypts, a sculptor working on a sarcophagus accidentally broke through an ancient wall. He reported finding a small dark cavity containing a figurine of twisted aspect, neither man nor beast, of a stone that drank the light. He brought it to his patron, a cardinal known for his esoteric interests. The cardinal dismissed it as a pagan trifle, but kept it. His subsequent letters, preserved in the Secretum, speak of increasing nightmares, a coldness of the soul, and a conviction that something was listening from the walls. He died within the year, and the figurine was logged into the vault with a single stark classification: res idolatrae infanda, unspeakable idolatrous object. The pattern continued into the modern era. In 1922, the year Pius XI ascended the throne, a routine cataloguing of the Secretum uncovered a folio from the time of Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Borgia pontiff. Known for his occult dabbling, Alexander had ordered a survey of all subterranean structures beneath the Vatican. The folio contained a map drawn on vellum showing the known crypts and catacombs. But in the area directly beneath the apse of Old St. Peter's, the cartographer had drawn a curious symbol, a spiral descending into a black dot, annotated in the Borgia cipher. A Vatican linguist in the 1920s, after years of work, managed a partial translation of the cipher's key, found on another fragment. The phrase next to the spiral read, Ostium Terræ, the door of the earth, and below it a warning, Quod superius est sicut quod inferius, et quod inferius est sicut quod superius, ad perpetranda miracula rei unius. A twisted paraphrase of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. But the Borgia scribe had altered the last words. It did not say, one thing. It said, unius horroris, of the one horror. These scattered pieces, the sealed chamber of 1939, the dead labourers, the cursed figurine, the Borgia map, were like points on a dark constellation. When connected, they formed a shape that pointed inexorably downward. The Vatican Hill, it seemed, was not merely a convenient burial ground or a symbolic foundation. It was a locus, a site chosen not by Peter, nor by Constantine, who built the first basilica, but by something far older. The horrifying secret was not in the crypts. The crypts, in their entirety, were built to contain it. This was the terrible knowledge that dawned on a select few within the Secretum. They were not guardians of a faith, but wardens of a prison. And the 1939 excavation, in its search for apostolic purity, had risked tapping on the walls of the oldest cell in the world. The responsibility for this silent custody fell to a succession of men known only as the Custos Inferi, the keeper of the underworld. This was not an official title, but a clandestine duty passed in whispers from one trusted cardinal to another, always from the dying to the living, during a secret rite performed not in a chapel, but in the deep vaults of the Secretum. The last true custos in the old tradition was Cardinal Vittorio Grimani, who inherited the burden in 1958. A theologian and former diplomat, Grimani was a man of formidable intellect and unshakable faith. He was shown the artifacts, read the fragmented reports, and studied the Borgia map. His predecessor's final words to him were, "The seal is not stone, the seal is belief. Remember, the hill was sacred before it was holy." Driven by a scholar's need to understand the enemy he was bound to guard, Grimani embarked on a private heretical study. He cross-referenced the Vatican's forbidden holdings with pre-Christian Roman texts and fragmentary Etruscan law held in the Bibliotheca Apostolica. The Vatican Hill, or Mons Vaticanus, was a minor hill in ancient Rome, outside the city boundary, considered somewhat ill-omened. It was a place of marshes and, crucially, of the cult of Sibylla, the great mother whose rites were frenzied and bloody. But Grimani traced a thread even further back. In a mildewed 16th century copy of a lost Roman chronicle, he found a passing reference to a lapis vaticanus, a Vatican stone. It was described not as a building material, but as an oracle, a mouth of the earth, consulted in times of extreme crisis during the early kingdom of Rome. The descriptions were vague, shrouded in archaic language, but they spoke of answers that came not as words, but as feelings placed directly in the mind, and of a price paid in blood and silence. The chronicle stated the last consultation occurred during the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC, after which the Senate, horrified by the counsel received, ordered the lapis sealed. The hill was declared funestus, doomed, fatal. This was the door of the earth on the Borgia map. The Church, in its infinite practicality, had not eradicated the pagan past. It had simply built over it, layer upon layer, using the weight of its most sacred structures to pin the ancient horror in place. The tomb of Peter, the literal rock of the Church, was the capstone. This was the ultimate hidden truth of the nobility and royalty of the Church. The Papacy, in its majestic spiritual authority, also served as the chief warden of a cosmic prison. The coronation of every pope, unknown to the world and to most of the cardinals themselves, was a renewal of that wardenship. But Grimani's research led him to a more immediate and terrifying conclusion. The 1939 excavation in breaking into the Necropolis and disturbing the sealed chamber had not broken the seal, but it had, he believed, created a hairline fracture. The presence, the archaeologist felt, the coldness reported by the long-dead cardinal, the nightmares, these were not ghosts. They were symptoms. The prison was intact, but the inmate was stirring. And it was reaching out, not with claws, but with thoughts. It offered knowledge, glimpses of hidden truths, fragments of power. It whispered to those whose ambition or faith had a crack of its own. Grimani began to see its influence not in supernatural events, but in very human ones, in sudden, irrational decisions within the Curia, in outbreaks of heresy that seemed to promise a darker, more primal form of transcendence, in the corruptions of spirit that always plague power, but now seemed to follow a specific, insidious pattern. The horror was not trying to break down its walls. It was patiently, slowly, convincing someone on the inside to open the door. Cardinal Grimani's fears coalesced around a specific, brilliant and deeply troubled man, Monsignor Alistair Finch, a Scottish-born archivist within the Secretum itself. Finch was a prodigy, fluent in a dozen dead languages, with a mind like a steel trap for patterns. Grimani had handpicked him for the tedious work of cataloguing the most obscure fragments related to the Lapis Vaticanus. It was a test, and Finch passed it with terrifying brilliance. He made connections Grimani had missed, cross-referencing Babylonian star charts with the architectural alignments of the necropolis, suggesting the door was not just a spiritual metaphor but a geomantic focal point, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. But Grimani watched as the work changed Finch. The Monsignor's fervent Catholic faith began to mutate into something else, a feverish, Gnostic obsession. He started speaking of the entity beneath not as a horror to be contained, but as a Sophia Incarcerata, a trapped wisdom, a source of divine knowledge that the institutional church had suppressed to maintain its power. He quoted heretical texts Grimani knew were not in the accessible archives. Where had he found them? The breach came on a cold January night in 1963. Grimani, acting on a gut-deep dread, went to the Secretum vaults unannounced. He found Finch not at his desk, but in a restricted anteroom, hunched over a facsimile of the Borgia map. On the margin, Finch was sketching not with ink, but with a dark, viscous substance that smelled of iron and myrrh, his own blood mixed with ash from censers. He was transcribing a chant in a looping pre-Latin script, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "It doesn't speak in words, Eminence," Finch whispered without looking up, his voice raspy. "It speaks in pressure, in the pull of the blood. It's showing me the key. The capstone is not just Peter, it's the line, the unbroken line from him to the present. The apostolic succession itself is the lock." Grimani felt a chill that had nothing to do with the vault's temperature. Finch had stumbled upon the ultimate secret. The prison's integrity was symbiotically tied to the legitimacy of the papacy. A break in the line, a disputed election, an anti-pope, a pope deemed profoundly invalid, would weaken the seal, and a pope who willingly turned the key. He had Finch removed from the Secretum that night, assigning him to a silent monastic retreat in the Alps. The Monsignor went quietly, a strange, knowing smile on his pale face. But Grimani knew the damage was done. The entity had found a crack in Finch's brilliant mind and seeped in. It now had a prophet, and worse, a theoretician. The knowledge of how the seal worked was no longer contained within the custos alone. Grimani spent the next decade strengthening the invisible defences. He quietly orchestrated the placement of certain ancient relics, a sliver of the true cross, the veil of Veronica, in specific locations in the grottos, not as objects of veneration, but as geomantic, anchors following patterns he deduced from Finch's own early uncontaminated notes. He also began to compile a dossier, not for the present, but for his successor. He called it Liber Aeternum Vigilii, the Book of Eternal Vigil. It contained everything he knew, everything he feared, and a final grim hypothesis. The entity was not merely some ancient demon, it was older than humanity. It was a shard of the chaos that existed before the Word, a sentient void that fed on belief and fear, and whose ultimate goal was not to escape into our world, but to unravel the very fabric of creation, starting at the point where humanity had tried to build its highest altar to order and light. The Vatican was not just a prison, it was the front line. Continue, Part 5. Cardinal Grimani died in his sleep in 1978, a year that would become infamous as the year of 3 popes. His secret, and the weighty Liber Aeternum Vigiliae, passed to his successor, a Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyła. The transition was rushed, conducted in the stifling air of a vault just days before the conclave that would, in a twist of fate Wojtyła could never have anticipated, elect him Pope John Paul II. Thus the new Custos Inferi ascended to the very throne of Peter, becoming the ultimate warden and the living capstone in one person. No pope in modern history had ever borne this dual burden with such full consciousness. John Paul XI was a man of profound mysticism and iron will. He studied Grimani's book, and his theological mind grasped the horrifying elegance of the prison. His own faith became both a shield and a sword. He expanded the secret efforts, embedding prayers of binding into the very liturgy, using his global travels to consecrate specific sites around the world as distant buttresses to the Vatican's spiritual geometry. He understood that in an age of growing skepticism, the seal was weakening, faith was the mortar, and it was crumbling. But the entity beneath, patient as stone, was also adapting. Its whispers found new channels in the late 20th century. It could not easily touch a pope of such fortified spirit, so it worked on the periphery. Grimani's fears about Monsignor Finch proved prophetic. From his Alpine exile, Finch, now a broken, spectral figure intellectually, had begun to correspond. Not through normal post, but through classified ads in obscure academic journals, using a cipher based on Etruscan funeral texts. His letters were tracts of luminous, terrifying heresy, describing the substratum god, the divine below, waiting to consummate a sacred inversion of heaven and earth. These writings attracted a following, a scattered network of disillusioned scholars, fringe archaeologists and occultists drawn to power. They called themselves the Clavis Aurea, the Golden Key. They believed they were preparing for a revelation, a second renaissance born from the earth's deepest wisdom. They had no central leader, but Finch, the hermit of the Alps, was their unseen guide. Their goal was not to storm the Vatican, but to understand the lock. They sought evidence of historical moments when the seal had faltered. The Cadavers Synod of 897 AD, when a pope put his predecessor's corpse on trial. The Avignon Papacy, which split the line, the reign of the allegedly Satanist Pope Leo VI, of whom Martin Luther said, "God has given us over to a monster." John Paul II, through a small, trusted department within the Swiss Guard that handled internal spiritual security, monitored the Clavis Aurea. He saw them as a symptom, not the disease, a psychic rash caused by the infection stirring below. The real battle was one of atmosphere, of soul. He could feel it during his private prayers in the grottos, a profound, silent pressure, like diving into deep water, a weight against the chest that was not his own illness. The prison held, but it groaned, and then, in 1996, a discovery was made that sent a seismic tremor through both the Vatican's secret guardians and the Clavis Aurea. During renovations to stabilise the foundations beneath the Vatican Library, a previously unknown sub-crypt was unearthed. It was not Roman nor early Christian. Its architecture was brutally primitive, cyclopean, stones so large their joining seemed seamless, fitted together in a way that predated Roman engineering. In its centre was an altar, not of marble, but of that same black non-local stone noted in centuries of reports. And on the floor before it, etched into the rock, was a perfect, vast spiral, leading to a central depression that was not empty. It contained a fine grey ash. Analysis would later confirm it was of human origin, burned at an impossibly high temperature. This was not a tomb. It was a furnace, a place of obliteration. The oldest layer of the horror had been found, and it revealed a terrifying truth. The entity didn't just feed on fear, it demanded annihilation as an offering. The discovery of the Cyclopean subcrypt was a crisis of the highest order. Pope John Paul II, his body already betraying him with Parkinson's disease, felt the spiritual tremor as a physical blow. The existence of this pre-Roman, perhaps even pre-Etruscan structure, confirmed the worst hypotheses in Grimani's Liber Aeternum Vigiliae. The horror was not a resident of the hill, it was the reason for the hill. Every successive layer of civilization, whoever they were, Etruscans, Romans, Christians, had not built temples to worship here. They had built fortresses to contain. The site was immediately placed under the jurisdiction of the secretive Office of Sacred Heritage, a bland name for the Swiss Guards intelligence arm. A hushed, urgent archaeology commenced, led by a dour, methodical priest-archaeologist named Father Aldo Gianni. His instructions were clear: document everything, retrieve nothing. No samples of the black stone, no trace of the ash. Photographs only, on non-digital, film to be developed in a secure darkroom. But the Clavisoria knew. Finch's network, which had eyes and ears in the most unexpected places, contractors, low-level librarians, a clerk in the restoration lab, intercepted whispers of a primary chamber and proto-architecture. For the Golden Key, this was the ultimate validation. Their mythos crystallized around this discovery. The Black Altar was the true Lapis Vaticanus, the original mouth of the earth, the font of primeval knowledge before it was demonized by jealous later gods. Finch, now an old man whose mind existed in a twilight between genius and madness, penned a final ecstatic tract. He argued that the ash was not a residue of sacrifice but of transmutation, the burnt bridge between mortal matter and divine understanding. The goal, he wrote, was not to destroy the seal, but to rekindle the furnace and complete the alchemy. This divergence in understanding, the Vatican seeing a site of abomination, the Clavis seeing a site of transcendence, set the stage for a silent war in the dark. The battleground was information. The Vatican sought to erase all evidence. The Clavis sought to obtain it, to prove their thesis to a wider, susceptible world hungry for hidden truths. Father Gianni's work was a race against this invisible enemy. He and his small team worked in a bubble of artificial light, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and a strange metallic tang that seemed to emanate from the Black Altar itself. They documented the spiral, noting its precise mathematical properties, a Fibonacci sequence that warped into something non-Euclidean at the innermost coil. They found no artifacts, no bones, no inscriptions. The utter emptiness was more unnerving than any relic. It suggested a process that left no trace, consumed everything, only the ash. Then Gianni made a personal, fatal error. Driven by a scientist's need for definitive proof, he disobeyed orders. Using a miniature vacuum sampler, he collected a minuscule amount of the grey ash, sealing it in a lead-lined vial. He told himself it was for secure future study, but the moment the vial left the subcrypt, he felt a change. The oppressive, watchful silence of the chamber seemed to follow him. That night, in his Spartan quarters, he dreamt not of images but of a single sustained note, a frequency that vibrated in his teeth and bones. He woke with a nosebleed. The blood blackened tarry in the dawn light. He reported his transgression and symptoms to his superior, a stoic Swiss Guard colonel. The vial was confiscated, placed in the deepest secretum vault, but the link was formed. Gianni became a conduit. Over the next weeks he began to know things. Snatches of dead languages he'd never studied floated into his mind. He could sense the emotional state of people nearby as a taste in his mouth. Fear was bitter, anxiety sour. The entity was not speaking to him, it was tuning him, it was demonstrating through him that the knowledge it offered was real, tangible, addictive. And it was a bait. Gianni, a man of faith, recognized the temptation for what it was. In his final report he wrote, "It does not corrupt. It clarifies, until all that is left is the clarity of the void. It shows you the emptiness at the heart of all things and calls it peace." Then he requested extreme unction and a transfer to a remote desert monastery. He died en route of a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. The silent war had claimed its first known casualty. The death of Father Gianni was a shockwave within the innermost circle. For Pope John Paul II, it was a brutal confirmation that the entity's influence was no longer a passive emanation, but an active, targeted force. It could now reach out and touch those who interacted with its physical remnants. The lead-lined vault in the secretum was not just a storage unit. It had become a reliquary of anti-holiness, holding the ash vial that now seemed to pulse with a malevolent potential. The Pope's response was twofold, reflecting his dual nature as sovereign and custos. Publicly, he embarked on a grand global mission of repentance and renewal for the approaching millennium, calling for the Church to purify its memory. This was genuine pastoral care, but it also served a hidden purpose, to strengthen the spiritual fortifications of the faith worldwide, reinforcing the mortar of the seal. Privately, he authorized a project so secret, its records were kept separate even from the secretum. Codenamed Operazione Pietra Angolare, Operation Cornerstone, it involved a team of theologians, exorcists, and quantum physicists, the latter recruited from devout Catholic backgrounds. Their task was audacious, to attempt to scientifically and theologically model the lock. Using Gianni's data, the Fibonacci spiral distortion, and centuries of anecdotal reports of cold spots and psychological disturbances within the necropolis, they tried to map the prison's metaphysical architecture. The physicist, a brilliant Jesuit named Father Karl Reinhardt, proposed a terrifying analogy. He suggested the entity existed in a state of metaphysical superposition, both contained and uncontained, its potentiality spread across the probability field of the site. Faith, focused prayer, and the unbroken apostolic line acted as a conscious observer, collapsing that potentiality into a contained state, the theological equivalent of quantum observation holding a particle in place. The black altar and its ash were a null point, a place where that observation failed, where the wave function of the horror remained uncollapsed and potent. Finch's heretical idea of the sacred inversion was, in Reinhardt's cold analysis, an attempt to consciously recollapse reality around the entity's state, making it the observed truth, and our world the phantom. This was the pinnacle of the horrifying secret. The Vatican was not just sitting on an ancient monster. It was the central processing unit for a reality maintenance program, with the Pope as its living faith-driven processor. And the system was under attack. Meanwhile, the Clavis Aurea was evolving. The death of Finch in his Alpine cell in 1999 did not disband them. It martyred him. His final writings, smuggled out and disseminated through encrypted channels, became their gospel. They shifted from theory to practice. A cell within the group, led by a charismatic Italian historian of esotericism named Dr. Silvana Conti, began to focus on ritual replication. If the ash was the residue of transmutation, they would attempt the formula. Their sources were chaos magic, Gnostic texts, and Finch's extrapolations from the Borgia ciphers. They sought not to break into the Vatican, but to create a sympathetic resonance, a smaller door elsewhere that would vibrate in harmony with the main seal, cracking it through harmonic stress. They chose a location steeped in dark resonance, the catacombs beneath the Basilica of San Sebastiano fuori le Mura on the ancient Appian Way. This site was once the Ad Catacumbas, near the Hollows, a temporary resting place for the bones of Peter and Paul, a place of powerful, transient sanctity overlapping with older pagan tombs. It was a perfect spiritual fault line. Here, in 2002, they performed their first major ritual. Using a stolen partial blueprint of the Vatican's Cyclopean subcrypt's dimensions, they drew a spiral in charcoal and ash, ordinary fireplace ash, a poor substitute they hoped intention would empower. They chanted Finch's reconstructed phrases. They reported no mystical light, no trembling earth. The effect was subtler, and far more insidious. For weeks after, members of the cell experienced a chilling synchronicity. They all had the same vivid, shared dream of a door opening not outwards, but inwards, into themselves. And in Rome, at the exact hour of their ritual, sensors placed by Reinhardt's team in the Vatican grottos registered a temporary localized drop in temperature of exactly 6.66 degrees Celsius, and a spike in anomalous electromagnetic noise that pattern matched, against astronomical odds, the brainwave frequency of a human in deep REM sleep. The clavis aurea had not opened a door. They had, however, succeeded in making the prisoner dream, and now it was dreaming of them. The anomalous readings from the San Sebastiano ritual were a fire alarm in the silent halls of Operazione Pietra Angolare. Father Reinhardt's models had predicted the possibility of sympathetic resonance, but the concrete data was chilling. The entity's dream state was not passive. It was a searching, probing frequency, and the clavis aurea had effectively sent up a flare, identifying themselves as willing communicants. The prison's integrity was no longer just a matter of internal faith, but of external attack. Pope John Paul II, his body frail but his will undimmed, made a drastic decision. The Custos Inferi tradition, passed secretly from cardinal to cardinal, was too vulnerable. The knowledge had to be insulated, digitized, and dispersed. He commissioned Reinhardt and a trusted Vatican computer scientist to create the Archivum Aeternum Digitalis, a highly encrypted, self-contained server with no network connection, storing every fragment of knowledge about the secret. Its physical location was known only to the Pope and his head of the Swiss Guard. It was a digital Liber Aeternum Vigiliae, a fallback in case the Custos line was broken or corrupted. But time was running out. The Pope's declining health was more than a personal tragedy. It was a geopolitical and spiritual crisis for the guardians of the secret. A dying Pope, a conclave, an interregnum. These were moments of supreme vulnerability when the apostolic line was in flux, the living capstone temporarily absent. The entity, they believed, would perceive this weakness as it perceived the San Sebastiano ritual, as an opportunity to exert pressure. In the spring of 2005, as John Paul II lay dying, the silent war entered its most critical phase. Within the Vatican, the focus was on spiritual continuity. Reinhardt's team, working with the master of papal liturgical celebrations, subtly embedded specific ancient binding phrases from the Secretum archives into the prayers for the dying and the rites for the Novum Dialis, the 9 days of mourning. It was an attempt to weave a net of words to hold the seal steady during the transition. Outside, the clavis aurea saw the imminent death not as a vulnerability, but as a cosmic alignment. Dr. Silvana Conti's cell interpreted it as the setting of the old sun, a necessary precursor to the rising of their subterranean sun. They planned their most ambitious ritual to coincide with the moment of the Pope's passing. Their target was not a church catacomb this time, but a site of raw pre-Christian power. The lapis niger in the Roman Forum, the black stone traditionally marking a cursed tomb or a doorway to the underworld, they believed it was a sister site to the Lapis Vaticanus, part of the same ancient geomantic network. On the evening of April 2, 2005, as the world watched and prayed for the Pope in his final hours, Conti's group assembled at the secluded Lapis Niger. Their ritual was more sophisticated, more desperate. They had acquired, through black market channels, a small sample of soil from the Vatican gardens, a physical link to the hill. They mixed it with their own blood and ash, creating a slurry they used to anoint the ancient worn stones. They chanted, their voices a low hum in the shadow of the forum's ruins. At 9:37 p.m. in Rome, Pope John Paul II died, and in the Vatican grottos, every sensor Reinhardt's team had hidden went berserk. Temperature plummeted in a wave radiating from the black altar subcrypt. Electromagnetic readings spiked off the charts, but most terrifying were the audio pickups, which captured a sound beyond the range of human hearing. When slowed and amplified, it revealed itself as a deep seismic groan, like a mountain shifting, followed by a cascade of whispers in a chaotic babble of dead languages, and then, for exactly 6 seconds, pure, profound silence, an absence of all ambient noise so complete it was described later as the sound of reality holding its breath. The ritual at the Lapis Niger had not broken the seal, but combined with the death of the Custos Pope, it had struck it a hammer blow. The entity was no longer dreaming. It was awake and testing the walls of its cell with a newfound terrifying focus. The conclave that would elect Benedict XVI would take place not just in a spirit of mourning, but under a spiritual siege that none of the voting cardinals could perceive, yet all would subconsciously feel as a crushing, palpable atmosphere of dread. The conclave of 2005 was, for the unaware cardinals, an exercise in solemn duty under the weight of global expectation. For the few who knew, Father Reinhardt, the head of the Swiss Guard, and the dying Pope's private secretary, Archbishop Stanisław Dziwisz, it was a tense, silent vigil over a fissure in the world's foundation. The sensors in the grottos, though calmed from their initial frenzy, continued to register a persistent low-level anomaly, a constant, subaudible hum that seemed to pulse in time with the collective anxiety of the Church in transition. It was as if the silence following the entity's groan had been filled with a predatory, patient attention. The newly elected Pope Benedict XVI's, Joseph Ratzinger, was a man of unparalleled theological intellect and deep traditional faith. He was also the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the office once known as the Inquisition. His mind was a fortress of doctrinal precision. Within hours of his election, before his first public blessing, he was taken to the Secretum Vault. Archbishop Dziwisz, carrying out John Paul IX's final instruction, presented him with the digital key to the Archivum Aeternum Digitalis, and uttered the phrase that initiated a new custos in feri. The hill is silent, but the stone is not asleep. Benedict studied the evidence with the cold eye of a prosecutor. He grasped the theological nightmare immediately, an adversary that was not a mere fallen angel, but something ontologically prior, a deficit of being that sought to uncreate. It appealed not to sin, but to the pride of knowledge, the exact temptation that had ensnared Monsignor Finch. This understanding shaped Benedict's troubled papacy. His relentless emphasis on the dictatorship of relativism was, on one level, a philosophical stance. On the hidden level, it was a strategic defense. Relativism, the idea that there is no ultimate truth, was the perfect solvent for the seal, which was predicated on the absolute truth of the apostolic faith. To Benedict, the Clavis Aurea and their ilk were not harmless cranks. They were insurgents, knowingly or not, for the enemy. He tasked Reinhardt's team, now answering directly to a small council called the Concilium de Arcanis, Council of Secrets, with an aggressive new strategy, active monitoring and spiritual countermeasures. They began to use the sensor network not just to listen, but to respond. When anomalous spikes occurred, specially trained teams of priests would descend to specific points in the necropolis and recite the exorcismus in Satanamit Angelos Apostatikos, the most potent rite of expulsion, not to drive out a possessing spirit, but to reaffirm the boundary, to verbally re-solidify the walls. It was a war of vibrations. Meanwhile, the Clavis Aurea, emboldened by the shifting they felt during the interregnum, though they interpreted it as a stirring of the Great Mother, became more daring. Silvana Conti, now the de facto leader, theorized that the modern church's weakness was its bureaucracy. The secret, she believed, was held not by the Pope, but in the paper trail, the secretum itself. Her group began a sophisticated campaign to infiltrate the Vatican's support structure. They cultivated a disgruntled archivist, a woman named Eleanor, who felt her work was undervalued. Through flattery and shared esoteric interests, they groomed her, never revealing their full purpose. They only asked for interesting curiosities related to pre-Christian sites under Vatican property. In 2009, Eleanor provided them with a scan of a forgotten inventory list from the 17th century. It itemized objects found during the construction of a now sealed well in the Vatican gardens. Listed between a broken Tuscan column and ossuary fragments was an entry that made Conti's heart stop. Item: 1 speculum of black stone, circular, handspan, with spiral glyphs, property deemed periculosum et infandum, transferred to custodia inferiori. A mirror, not an altar, but a mirror, made of the same black stone. The implications rewired the Clavis Aurea's entire mythology. The entity wasn't a voice to be heard or a furnace to be stoked, it was something to be looked into. The sacred inversion was not about turning the world upside down, but about seeing a reflection of a truer, darker reality. Their goals shifted from ritual resonance to obtaining this object. The speculum was the key, they were now sure. and it was somewhere in the endless guarded labyrinth beneath their feet. They had identified a critical asset, and in doing so they had painted a target on the back of the entire horrifying secret. The discovery of the speculum's existence sent a jolt of fearful energy through both the Concilium de Arcanis and the Clavis Aurea. For the Vatican guardians, the mirror represented the most dangerous type of relic, a passive, interactive object. An altar required sacrifice, a door required opening, a mirror required only a glance. It was a direct interface, a potential window in the wall of the cell. Its location, logged as Custodia Inferiori, was a mystery. Grimani's Liber had mentioned a deep vault below even the secretum, but no map existed. Pope Benedict XVI, his papacy already beset by external scandals, now faced an internal siege of a different order. The pressure was immense, metaphysical, and deeply personal. He, the supreme defender of doctrinal clarity, was the warden of a secret that defied all dogma. In 2010, during the height of the clerical abuse crisis, he privately confided to Father Reinhardt, "The smoke of Satan enters not only through the sins of men, but through the cracks in the floor." He saw the moral failings of the Church not just as tragedies, but as symptoms of the spiritual entropy the entity fostered, a corrosion of will and virtue that made the seal porous. The Concilium initiated Project Speculum. Its mission: find and permanently neutralize the Black Mirror before the Clavis Aurea could even locate it. They used ground-penetrating radar and architectural analysis of centuries-old building plans to search for anomalies beneath the known crypts. The search was slow, delicate, and fraught with psychological danger. Teams reported feelings of being watched from behind, of hearing their names whispered in empty corridors, of tools malfunctioning in ways that defied electrical laws. Simultaneously, the Clavis Aurea, led by Silvana Conti, pursued a more human vector. Elena, their archivist, had been detected by Vatican security, not for espionage, but for excessive digital searches on restricted archive keywords. She was quietly reassigned to a meaningless clerical job, her access revoked. But the damage was done. Before being cut off, she had provided one more crucial piece. The 17th century inventory was signed by the overseeing cardinal, a man named Orazio Falconieri. Conti's research revealed Falconieri was a known antiquarian with suspected Hermeticist leanings. He had overseen several construction projects, including the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament in St. Peter's, and significantly, a now-forgotten Grotto of Renewal in the Vatican Gardens. Conti theorized Falconieri wouldn't have destroyed the speculum. A Hermeticist would have hidden it, perhaps even used it. She believed it was interred within the structure of one of his projects, a foundation stone of a darker kind. The Clavis Aurea now had a target location, the Vatican Gardens. Infiltrating the heavily guarded city-state was impossible, but observing it was not. Using high-powered lenses from apartments on the Janiculum Hill, they began a meticulous surveillance of the gardens, looking for any sign of maintenance, any unusual feature that might match descriptions of a grotto of renewal. The break came from an unexpected and tragic direction. In 2012, a young, devout Swiss, guard named Lucas Haas, posted to night duty in a little-used corridor near the gardens, began experiencing severe night terrors. He dreamt of a black pool that reflected not his face, but a hollowed-out version of himself. He woke each night at 3 a.m. precisely, drenched in a cold sweat, with the taste of ash in his mouth. Unaware of the secret war, he went to his chaplain, who, recognizing symptoms that matched protocols he knew only from vague warnings, reported it to the Concilium. Reinhardt's team interviewed Haas. The timing was critical. Haas's patrol route passed near the site of the old Falconieri grotto, now just a mossy, half-collapsed niche behind a hedge. Sensors placed near Haas's post showed a localized spike in anomalous activity at exactly 3 a.m. The entity was reaching out, trying to lure a new instrument, but in doing so it had given away the mirror's probable location. The speculum was acting like a beacon, and Haas was unwittingly tuning into its frequency. The Concilium faced a terrible choice. They had to secure the mirror immediately, but any action in the gardens risked exposure to the Clavis Aurea's watchful eyes, and they had to deal with Guard Haas. He was relocated to a remote guard post in Switzerland, under the guise of a health-related transfer, and placed under discreet spiritual care. But the connection had been made. The entity had tasted his psyche. In his nightmares, the black pool grew wider, and the reflection within began to move independently of him. The silent war now had a specific, suffering soldier on its front line, and a priceless, cursed artifact waiting to be found by whichever side was bold enough, or desperate enough, to reach into the dark first. The race for the speculum became a clandestine operation conducted under the serene surface of the Vatican gardens. Pope Benedict XVI, his resolve hardened by the palpable threat, authorized a midnight excavation. The concilium assembled a team of 4: Father Reinhardt, 2 Swiss Guard engineers with clearance level 0, and an elderly silent monk named Brother Ignatius, whose sole expertise was the ritual handling of blighted objects. They chose a night of a new moon, when cloud cover promised additional darkness. Their target was the crumbling Falconieri Grotto. Using the 17th century plans, they identified a section of the back wall that was not original tufa stone but a later brick infill. As the engineers worked with sound-dampened tools, the atmosphere grew thick. The humidity spiked, though the night was cool. Reinhardt's portable sensors, miniaturized versions of the grotto arrays, showed a rising curve of infrasound. It was a feeling more than a sound, a deep nauseating vibration in the bones, like standing atop a dormant engine that had just been switched on. When the bricks were carefully removed, they revealed not a hollow, but a solid, seamless slab of the black stone, roughly 2 feet square. It was set into the earth. There were no handles, no markings, only a cold, light-absorbing surface. Brother Ignatius stepped forward, chanting softly in Aramaic. He produced a vial of holy water, specially prepared with salt from the Dead Sea and blessed by the Pope himself. As the first drop touched the stone, it didn't bead or run. It was absorbed instantly, with a faint hissing sigh that seemed to come from the ground beneath them. The slab then slid aside without a sound, revealing a narrow vertical shaft descending into absolute blackness. One of the guards, a man named Bauer, was lowered down. His voice, relayed through a secure radio, was tight with strain. "It's a small chamber, maybe 6 feet square. Walls are the same black stone. There's a pedestal." A pause filled with the sound of his ragged breathing. "The mirror is here." Reinhardt instructed him not to look at its surface, only to secure it in the lead-lined container they had lowered with him. There was a long silence. Then Bauer's voice returned, whispery and distorted. "It's beautiful. The spiral on the back. It seems to move in the light." "Bauer, do not look at the front! Container now!" Reinhardt snapped. A scuffling sound, a sharp intake of breath. Then Bauer whispered, "It's not a reflection. It's a doorway. I can see fields, dark fields under a red sky." His voice was filled with awe, not fear. "Bauer, secure the artifact," the other guard hissed into his mic. A clatter, a thud. Then the sound of Bauer vomiting. The radio transmission became a screech of feedback before dying. The team above hauled frantically on the rope. When Bauer emerged, he was unconscious, the lead container clutched in his arms. The mirror was inside, sealed. But Bauer's eyes, even closed, streamed with thin, bloody tears. They had the speculum, but the cost was immediate and horrific. Guard Bauer never fully woke. He existed in a catatonic state, his brain activity showing patterns identical to the deep, dreaming sleep recorded during the San Sebastiano ritual, but permanent. He had looked into the mirror and seen what the entity wanted him to see. A vision of its reality, its promised land. His mind had chosen to stay there. Worse, their operation had not gone unnoticed. Silvana Conti, observing from afar with high-sensitivity night vision equipment, had seen the faint, concentrated heat signatures of the men and their lights in the grotto. She didn't know what they had found, but she knew they had found something. And their covert activity confirmed the mirror's existence and its location in the gardens. She now had a confirmed vector. The Clavis Aurea didn't need to infiltrate. They needed to compel the Vatican to act again, to force the secret into the open. Their strategy shifted to one of calculated exposure. If they could not possess the mirror, they would create a scandal so loud the world would demand to know what the Vatican was hiding beneath its gardens and crypts. The race was no longer for possession, it was for the narrative. The secured speculum was taken to the deepest custodia inferiori, a vault lined not with lead, but with a sandwiched alloy of silver, salt, and volcanic basalt, based on ancient prescriptions for containing spiritual malignancies. It was placed on a pedestal within a circle of inscribed prayers, a prison within a prison. But the artifact's capture did not bring peace. Instead, a new, unsettling phenomenon began. The Vatican censor network started registering what Father Reinhardt termed echo dreams. These were bursts of psychic imagery, not whispers, but vivid, fleeting scenes that bled into the minds of sensitive individuals near the grottos or the gardens. A nun tending roses saw a vision of the black stone altar overflowing with grey ash. A librarian in the secretum momentarily saw the scrolls around him as rolls of burnt skin. These were not attacks, but leakages. The mirror, even contained, was acting as an amplifier, broadcasting the entity's thoughts like a rogue transmitter. Pope Benedict XVI, already weary from the burdens of the papacy, found this silent psychic assault profoundly draining. The entity's nature as a deficit of being seemed to resonate with the overwhelming crises facing the Church. Each scandal, each loss of faith, felt like a brick loosened in the spiritual dam he was struggling to maintain. In February 2013, after much prayer and what he would later call a divine intuition, he did the unthinkable. He resigned. Publicly, he cited failing strength. Privately, in a sealed addendum to the Archivum Aeternum Digitalis, he stated that the role of custos inferi required a vigour of soul and body he no longer possessed. A failing warden, he believed, was more dangerous than no warden at all. The seal needed a new, strong capstone. His resignation was a seismic event that the Clavis Aurea interpreted as a monumental victory. Silvana Conti declared to her inner circle, "The Guardian has stepped aside. The door is unguarded." They redoubled their campaign of exposure, leaking anonymous, carefully crafted documents to fringe journalists and internet conspiracy theorists. These documents mixed real, obscure facts about the Vatican Necropolis with wild speculation about hidden knowledge, alien artifacts, and a counter-faith practiced beneath St. Peter's. Their goal was to create such a cacophony of rumour that legitimate investigation might be forced, shining a light into the dark. The interregnum and conclave of 2013 were, for the concilium, a period of white-knuckled terror. With Benedict alive but retired, the living capstone was in a state of unprecedented ambiguity. The censors recorded a constant aggressive pressure, like a storm tide pushing against a levee. The entity was testing the transition with a force it had not used before. Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio of Buenos Aires was elected Pope, Francis on March 13th. As with his predecessor, he was taken to the secretum. But Francis was a different man, a Jesuit, a pastor, a man of smell of the sheep, rather than theological fortresses. He was shown the Archivum Aeternum Digitalis, the vault, the comatose guard bower. His reaction was not one of intellectual analysis, but of visceral pastoral horror. He saw Bauer not as a casualty of war, but as a suffering sheep. He saw the secret not as a strategic burden, but as a wound festering at the heart of the Church. His first act as custos was not to reinforce the defences, but to ask a question that stunned Reinhardt and the concilium. Has anyone ever tried to speak to it? Not to bind or study, but to understand, to seek its redemption. This was heresy to the Guardians. The entity was beyond redemption. It was the antithesis of creation. But Francis, shaped by the Jesuit tradition of engaging even the most hostile cultures, saw a failure in centuries of pure containment. He authorized a controversial, desperate measure, a dialogues, not an exorcism, but a mediated encounter. They would use a deeply hypnotized, theologically trained medium, a willing priest, to make controlled, ritualized contact through the contained speculum, with the aim not of parley, but of diagnosis, to understand what it wanted beyond destruction. The concilium argued vehemently, but Francis's will, as Pope, was final. The horrifying secret was about to be approached not with a sword, but with a question, a risk that could be the ultimate act of folly, or the only path to a true solution. The dialogues was prepared with the grim precision of a suicide mission. The chosen medium was Father Matteo Rossi, a middle-aged theologian with a background in psychology and a mystic's temperament. He was a man of profound, quiet faith, known for his work in rehabilitating victims of cults. He volunteered, stating, "If it can offer nothing but emptiness, we must confront that emptiness to prove it has no power over a soul filled with God." His words were brave, but his hands trembled as he was prepared. The setting was the Custodia Inferiori vault. The speculum remained within its inscribed circle, but the lead container was opened. A one-way reflective shield was placed before it, allowing Rossi to look into the mirror only when a shutter was remotely opened. He was seated, wired with biometrics, and flanked by Brother Ignatius and Father Reinhardt, who would recite binding prayers at the first sign of possession. Pope Francis observed via a secure video feed from his private chapel, praying the rosary. At midnight, the shutter opened. Rossi gazed into the black surface. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, his breathing shallowed. His eyes lost focus, not glazing over but seeming to peer into an immense distance. "It is not a it," Rossi whispered, his voice flat, unlike his own. "It is a when. A point before. The word," Reinhardt leaned forward, "define the point." The silence before God said, "Let there be light." Rossi's head tilted. "It is the echo of that silence. It does not hate you. It seeks to return you to the state before the noise, before distinction, before sin, before choice. It offers the peace of unbeing." Brother Ignatius murmured a psalm. Rossi flinched as if stung. "Your words are thorns," Rossi said, the entity speaking through him now, its tone chillingly reasonable. "Your faith is a scaffolding built over a void. We are the void. We are more ancient than your devil. The devil believes. We precede belief." "What is your goal?" Reinhardt pressed, his voice tight. "Consumption is a crude word. We are assimilation. The collapse of the wave function, the triumph of the unobserved state. The hill is our altar. Your Peter's bones are the keystone of your illusion. Remove them, and the architecture of your reality here simplifies." The threat was clear. Destroy the tomb of Peter, break the apostolic line physically, and the geometric lock would fail. Rossi's body began to shiver violently. "It is so cold in its clarity," he wept, his own personality breaking through. "It offers no pain, only cessation. It is the answer to all suffering, the end of all questions." His faith was battling a temptation far more profound than evil, the temptation of absolute silent zero. "Father Rossi," Reinhardt said firmly, "remember the crucifixion, remember the word." Rossi gasped, a sudden racking breath. "It shows me the cross. It says it is the true shape, not a symbol of sacrifice, but a map. The vertical line, the connection you try to make to your heaven, the horizontal, the reach of our domain, where they intersect. That is this place, the intersection, the wound." His biometrics spiked. Blood began to seep from his nostrils, twin rivulets of black. Brother Ignatius slammed the shutter closed. Rossi collapsed, sobbing, clutching his crucifix. The contact was broken. The dialogues was a catastrophic success. They had gained invaluable intelligence, the entity's true nature as a pre-creation void, its target, Peter's tomb, and its method, offering the peace of oblivion. But they had also let it directly interface with a priest's soul, and Rossi was permanently scarred. He would later describe feeling a part of his own faith, the comforting sense of God's presence, as having been scooped out, like marrow from a bone, leaving only the hollow architecture of belief behind. Worst of all, the concilium realized a terrifying possibility. The dialogues might have been a two-way street. If they could listen to the entity, had the entity, through Rossi, better learned how to listen to them? Had they just taught it how to more effectively tailor its whispers of nothingness to the human psyche? Pope Francis, watching from his chapel, felt a profound despair. His pastoral gambit had revealed the monster's face, and the monster had smiled back with the void. The only path forward now seemed to be a war of attrition they were slowly losing. And the Clavis Aurea, still weaving their net of exposure, was about to hand the world a megaphone. The aftermath of the dialogues left the Vatican's guardians reeling. Father Rossi was placed in a care facility, his condition a living testament to the cost of knowledge. The entity's revealed target, the tomb of Peter, meant the physical heart of the Basilica was now a strategic vulnerability. Security, both physical and spiritual, around the Confessio was tripled in secret. The concilium debated drastic measures, Should the bones of the apostle be quietly moved to a safer, unknown location? But the theological and symbolic repercussions were unthinkable. The seal's power was tied to their known presence in that specific spot. Moving them might break the lock as surely as destroying them. While the Vatican turned inward to protect its core, the clavis aurea struck. Silvana Conti, through layers of digital cutouts, delivered a package to a notorious Italian investigative journalist known for anti-clerical exposés. It contained high-resolution photographs of the 17th century inventory, listing the speculum, along with forged but credible-looking memos referencing anomalous subterranean artifacts and Project Speculum. The accompanying dossier wove a compelling, public-friendly narrative. The Vatican had discovered a revolutionary archaeological artifact under its grounds, perhaps a piece of advanced ancient technology, or an object of immense historical value, and was suppressing it to protect church dogma. The story broke in the spring of 2016. It was a global sensation. News outlets, hungry for Vatican scandal, ran with headlines like, "The Pope's Secret Vault," and "What is the Vatican hiding?" The official denials were swift and firm, but they only fueled the fire. Conspiracy theorists, ancient astronaut proponents, and anti-authority activists united in a chorus demanding transparency. For the first time in centuries, the hidden war risked erupting into the blinding light of international scrutiny. Pope Francis faced a dilemma. He could not reveal the truth. To do so would shatter public faith, cause panic, and potentially empower every fringe group seeking to exploit the horror. Yet, stonewalling made the Church look guilty of a mundane, self-serving cover-up. His solution was a masterstroke of misdirection. He announced the formation of a Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology and Transparency, inviting a select group of respected secular archaeologists and scientists, people of impeccable reputation but no religious bias, to conduct a limited, supervised review of non-sensitive areas of the necropolis. The offer had conditions: no media, strict confidentiality agreements, and access granted, only to areas already well documented. It was a gamble. Give the world enough credible, boring truth to undermine the sensational lies. The commission, led by a skeptical but fair-minded German archaeologist named Professor Albrecht Vogel, spent 6 months conducting the review. They were shown the necropolis, the Trypaeon of Gaius, the early Christian tombs. They were allowed to take their own samples, conduct their own tests. They found nothing supernatural, nothing high-tech. Just ancient, poignant human history. Vogel's final report, while criticising Vatican secrecy in general, concluded there was no evidence of a hidden technological artifact or a massive cover-up of that nature. The public frenzy died down, relegated back to the fringe. But the operation had an unintended, chilling consequence. Professor Vogel, during his final tour, was taken through a section of the grottos near the sealed Cyclopean subcrypt. He didn't enter it. It was off the plan, hidden behind a reinforced wall, but he passed within 15 feet of it. A sensitive man, he later told his wife he'd felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of cosmic loneliness and a metallic taste in his mouth. Months after the report was published, Vogel, a lifelong agnostic, began having vivid, recurring nightmares of a black spiral. He started writing a book, not about Vatican secrets, but about the psychic archaeology of place, arguing that certain locations retain traumatic imprints that can affect the subconscious. He was getting warm, dangerously warm, from a different angle. The entity, it seemed, could also use the light of inquiry as a tool, planting seeds in fertile, intelligent minds. The Vatican had won the public relations battle, but the secret was now surrounded by a louder, more sophisticated echo chamber of speculation. And the entity had demonstrated a new tactic. It could reach through walls, not to terrify, but to inspire, to turn the seeker of truth into an unwitting cartographer of its own prison. The silence beneath was no longer just a defensive secrecy. It was a quarantine that was beginning to leak. The final act of the hidden war begins not with a grand ritual or a theft, but with a slow, psychological unravelling. The clavis aurea, though disillusioned by the Commission's report, was not dissolved. Silvana Conti, her life's work publicly debunked, fell into a deep depression that soon morphed into something else, a fanatical, personal obsession. The entity, sensing a vessel ripe with bitterness and thwarted ambition, found the crack it needed. Her dreams became conduits. Where once she received intellectual fragments, She now received direct, visceral impressions. The exact feel of the black stone, the angle of the spiral on the speculum's back, the location of the forgotten Falconieri grotto as a pulsating point of cold in her mind's eye. The entity was no longer whispering to a group. It was programming a single, desperate instrument. Simultaneously, within the Vatican, the strain of the dual papacy, the retired Benedict living in the gardens, Francis on the throne, created a subtle but profound theological dissonance that the entity fed upon. The living capstone was, in a sense, split. The concilium's sensors detected a new pattern. The pressure waves from below were synchronizing with the rhythms of the two popes' public appearances, as if testing the resonance between them. The seal was not broken, but it was humming with a dangerous harmonic. In the winter of 2022, Silvana Conti, acting alone, made her move. Using decades of knowledge and the eerie GPS-like guidance in her head, she bypassed the Vatican's high-tech security by exploiting its oldest layer, the medieval Passetto di Borgo, the secret wall passage used by popes to flee to Castel Sant'Angelo. A section of its forgotten lower cellar, known only from Borgia-era maps she had studied, led into a service tunnel disused for centuries. She emerged like a ghost from another time into the Vatican gardens at 3 a.m. Guided by the cold spot in her perception, she found the Falconieri grotto, its brickwork still showing signs of the concilium's excavation. She didn't need tools. She pressed her hands against the specific stone, now knowing it was the back of the speculum's hiding place, and whispered the phrase that had come to her in dreams, a sequence of sounds that were not words but tonal vibrations. The stone, still resonating with the energy of its recent disturbance, slid aside. The shaft was empty, the mirror gone. But the entity didn't want the mirror. It wanted the place, the point of interface. Conti climbed down into the small black chamber. She didn't need the artifact. She had become one. She sat in the darkness, cross-legged on the pedestal where the mirror had rested, and began to meditate, to open her mind completely, to become a perfect receiver. She was not there to steal or destroy. She was there to act as a living wedge, to focus the entity's full pressure on the single, most vulnerable point in the seal, the intersection of the two papal lines, the split in the capstone. In the concilium control room, alarms screamed. The sensors at the grotto site spiked into the red, then went dead. But the sensors around St. Peter's tomb showed a terrifying inverse effect, a draining away of all spiritual background radiation, a vacuum of faith being created. The entity was using Conti's consciousness as a siphon, pulling at the key stone. Father Reinhardt, now an old man, knew this was the endgame. There was no time for a team. He took a vial of the specially prepared holy water and a simple, ancient wooden crucifix from a reliquary of the true cross. He descended alone into the necropolis, heading not for the grotto but for the tomb itself. He understood. The battle was no longer in the dark where the horror lived. It was at the altar where faith met it, in the black chamber. Conti's eyes flew open, filled with the dark reflection of the void. A smile of sublime, terrible peace touched her lips. She spoke, her voice a chorus of whispers. The intersection is mine. Above, in the Basilica, at the exact moment of Reinhardt's prayer before the tomb, the great dome seemed to hold its breath. Pilgrims below felt a sudden, profound stillness, a silence so deep it felt like deafness. For 3 heartbeats the world seemed to grey at the edges, as if all colour and substance were draining away into a single silent point beneath the gardens. Then, from the confessio, a warm, golden light seemed to pulse. Not a physical light, but a feeling of immense, stubborn human love. Reinhardt on his knees was not performing an exorcism. He was simply, fervently, repeating the words of the first pope. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. In the chamber, Conti convulsed. The entity's peace was absolute, but it was a peace of nothing. Against the specific, personal, flawed and enduring love of a fisherman, the void had no answer. The siphon shattered. Silvana Conti let out a sigh that was entirely her own, a sound of infinite loss, and slumped, empty. The sensors returned to baseline. The silence beneath returned to its watchful, contained state. The seal held, but by the thinnest of threads, not by grand ceremony or hidden knowledge, but by a love that chose to believe in the face of the abyss. Reinhardt emerged, aged a decade in an hour. The secret remained, buried deeper than ever. Conti's body was found and quietly interred in an unmarked grave. The world moved on, unaware how close it had come to the silent unravelling. The horrifying truth beneath the Vatican crypts endures, a testament to a battle that must be fought in perpetual silence, where the only victory is a continuation of the watch, and the only hope is that the love above remains stronger than the ancient hungry silence below.